Chicago, Illinois. What would you do if the person who ruined your life sat right in front of you? The courtroom was colder than Marcus Holloway had expected. The marble floors, the towering wooden benches, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing into him. It all made him feel small. But he refused to shrink. At 12 years old, Marcus never imagined he would be standing here, testifying in front of a judge, lawyers, and reporters. He clenched his hands together, steadying himself. This wasn't just about him. This was about survival. The man sitting at the bench, Judge Carlton Reeves, had signed the eviction order that destroyed his family's life. He had ignored his mother's pleas, dismissed the evidence, and sent them onto the streets without so much as a second thought. Marcus remembered that night clearly. His mother, Vanessa Holloway, had worked double shifts to keep up with the rent. But when their landlord raised the price overnight, there was no warning, no grace period, just a notice taped to the door. Then the police came. His little sister, Layla, had been sick. The cold from the streets only made it worse. His mother lost her job because she had nowhere to leave them. They had gone from a 2-bedroom apartment to a shelter, then from a shelter to nothing at all. All because of one signature, one ruling. And now, the man responsible sat just feet away from him. "State your name for the record," the lawyer beside him instructed. Marcus sat up straighter. His voice didn't shake. "Marcus Holloway." The lawyer nodded. "Can you tell us why you are here today?" Marcus took a breath. "Because Judge Reeves forced my family onto the streets. And now I want to know why." A hush fell over the courtroom. Reeves stiffened at the words. The prosecutor frowned, shifting uncomfortably. The lawyer continued. "Marcus, can you explain what happened after the eviction?" Marcus nodded. "My mom lost her job. My sister got sick. We lost everything." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward. "We tried to fight it, but no one listened, no one helped. And now," he turned his gaze to the judge, eyes burning, "now I want to know how one man could take everything from us." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashing. Judge Reeves adjusted his tie, his expression tightening. The lawyer stepped back. "Your Honor, we are here today because Marcus Holloway and his family were unlawfully evicted due to fraudulent property dealings. Evidence has surfaced that multiple eviction orders, including theirs, were processed under questionable circumstances." The judge cleared his throat. "That is speculation." "It's not," Marcus interrupted, his voice stronger now. "We weren't the only ones. I've seen the names. Families like mine thrown out of their homes, while landlords made money and no one did anything about it." The courtroom murmured. The weight of Marcus's words hung heavy in the air. The lawyer turned to Judge Reeves. "This court demands transparency. Marcus and his family deserve answers." Judge Reeves looked around, his gaze darting to the officials at the prosecution's table. For the first time, Marcus saw something in his expression. Fear. The question he had asked had shaken the courtroom. But he wasn't finished yet. Because today, the truth was coming out. "Where are you watching from? And what time is it?" Marcus Holloway had always believed that if you worked hard and followed the rules, life would be fair. His mother, Tasha Holloway, had raised him to believe that. She worked 2 jobs, paid rent on time, and never complained. But none of that mattered when powerful people decided they wanted something she had: their home. The trouble had started when a wealthy developer set his sights on their building. He wanted to turn it into luxury condos, and the families who lived there were nothing more than obstacles in the way of his profits. At first, Tasha thought it was a mistake. Their lease wasn't up, and she had done everything right. But then came the notices. Rent was increasing beyond what anyone in the building could afford. When she and her neighbors protested, the landlord didn't negotiate. He just waited. Then, without warning, an eviction notice appeared on their door. Tasha had proof that the eviction was illegal. She had documents showing the landlord had falsified lease violations to push tenants out. She hired a lawyer, filed appeals, and did everything in her power to fight back. But when the case went to court, Judge Evelyn Whitaker didn't even let her finish speaking. She ruled in favor of the developer without a second thought. Marcus had been sitting in that courtroom when it happened. He had watched his mother plead for time, had seen the way the judge barely looked at her. It was as if their lives were nothing more than an inconvenience. No warning, no options, just a notice to leave. Marcus had whispered as they walked out of the courtroom that day. They had exactly 1 week before the city sent officers to force them out. 7 days to figure out what to do when there was nowhere to go. On the last morning, the police arrived. Marcus stood frozen as uniformed officers carried their belongings to the curb. His little sister, Layla, clutched his hand, crying. His mother stood tall, trying to reason with them, but there was no reasoning with orders that had already been signed. By the time the sun set, their apartment was no longer theirs. The streets, the shelters, the uncertainty, that was all they had left. Marcus watched as the developer's team arrived the very next day, inspecting the empty building like vultures circling prey. They didn't see the families who had lived there. They didn't see what they had taken. But Marcus saw them, and that's when he knew. This wasn't over. The real fight, it was just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, the aisles lined with reporters, activists, and lawyers. The weight of the city's attention pressed down on the room, an unspoken tension thick in the air. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a battle. Judge Evelyn Whitaker sat tall at the bench, her expression cold and unreadable. She had presided over countless cases, never wavering, never bending. To her, this was just another day in court. But for Marcus Holloway, it was the moment he had been waiting for. Tasha Holloway sat beside her lawyer, her back straight, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She had fought too hard for this moment, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. But before she could speak, before her lawyer could even begin, Marcus stood up. His chair scraped against the floor as he pointed a trembling finger at the judge. "You made me homeless! Why?" Gasps filled the room. Reporters lifted their cameras. Activists murmured in shock. The gallery buzzed with whispers as the judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order. "Silence!" Judge Whitaker barked. "Sit down, young man." Marcus didn't move. His voice shook, but his feet stayed planted. "You knew what you were doing. You took our home for money." The murmurs turned into full-blown discussion. The judge's eyes flickered toward the prosecution table, where the developer's attorneys sat stone-faced. For the first time, Marcus saw something in her expression, a crack in her confidence. "Marcus, sit down," his mother pleaded, reaching for his hand. But he shook his head, his voice ringing out once more. "No, she needs to answer me. She took everything from us, and she doesn't even care." The judge slammed her gavel again. "This is not how court proceedings work. Neither is throwing families onto the street without listening to them." Marcus shot back. The silence that followed was deafening. The tension in the room shifted. Even the judge could feel it. The air was thick with unspoken truths, with the weight of injustice finally laid bare. Tasha took a slow breath and turned toward the judge, her voice calm but steady. "Your Honor, we have proof that our eviction was unlawful. Documents were forged, lease violations were fabricated, and you ignored it all." Judge Whittaker's lips tightened. "These are serious accusations." "They're not accusations," Tasha's lawyer said, sliding a file onto the desk. "They're facts." The judge hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly as she reached for the documents. The courtroom held its breath as she flipped through the pages. Her expression remained unreadable, but the pause, the long, deliberate pause, told everyone in the room what they needed to know. The truth was inescapable. Reporters whispered among themselves, cameras still rolling. The prosecution shifted in their seats. The weight of Marcus's words still lingered in the air, impossible to ignore. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Marcus knew he was winning. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was on Marcus Holloway as he stood firm, facing the defense attorney who had just attempted to dismiss him. The man smirked, adjusting his tie. "Young man, do you have proof?" he asked, his tone laced with condescension. Marcus didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded sheet of paper, his fingers steady, as he handed it to his mother's attorney. "This," Marcus said, his voice unwavering, "is a leaked email from Judge Whittaker." Gasps rippled through the room. The attorney took the paper and unfolded it, scanning its contents before clearing his throat. The courtroom fell silent as he read aloud, "Approve the eviction, and the campaign funds will be transferred immediately." The moment the words left his mouth, chaos erupted. Journalists scrambled to take notes. Reporters whispered into their microphones, and spectators exchanged shocked glances. The once unshakable Judge Evelyn Whittaker sat frozen at the bench, her face drained of color. "This is fabricated," she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. "It's an outright lie." Marcus shook his head. "No, it's not, and we have bank records to prove it." The lawyer didn't miss a beat. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another set of documents, placing them firmly on the table. "Your Honor, these are records from Whittaker's campaign fund, showing multiple deposits from the development company in question, each one made immediately after an eviction ruling in their favor." More gasps filled the air. Some members of the jury leaned forward, wide-eyed. The reporters in the back of the room nearly tripped over one another in their rush to capture every detail. Judge Whittaker's hands trembled as she gripped the sides of her bench. "This is an outrageous accusation. You have no right. We have every right." Marcus's mother's lawyer cut in. "Because you, Judge Whittaker, have been using your power to illegally remove families from their homes in exchange for campaign money." The judge's mouth opened, then shut. Her once commanding presence had crumbled. The courtroom doors swung open. A court officer stepped inside, whispering something to the bailiff. Within seconds, hushed murmurs filled the air. The weight of the moment settled over the room. "Your Honor," the prosecutor finally spoke. "In light of this new evidence, we request an immediate suspension of all eviction rulings signed by Judge Whittaker pending further investigation." The judge said nothing. She couldn't. The walls were closing in. The corruption was unraveling before everyone's eyes. And Marcus had started it all. The courtroom was on edge. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to close in on Judge Evelyn Whittaker as the weight of her corruption settled over the room. She sat rigid at the bench, her fingers gripping the gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prosecutor stood, his voice firm. "Your Honor, I request an immediate investigation into Judge Whittaker." The words echoed through the chamber. Gasps rippled through the spectators, and reporters frantically scribbled notes. Judge Whittaker's eyes widened. She slammed her gavel down, the sharp crack cutting through the murmurs. "This is ridiculous! I have done nothing wrong!" Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the fear creeping into her composure. But the courtroom could see it. Her reputation, once untouchable, was crumbling before their very eyes. Marcus Holloway sat still, watching her carefully. He had spent too many nights wondering why this woman had chosen to ruin his family's life. Now, she was the one with no escape. His mother's attorney stepped forward, unshaken. "Then release the financial records," he challenged. "Prove you have nothing to hide." Judge Whittaker clenched her jaw, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She didn't answer. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Every lawyer, journalist, and official present knew what her silence meant. The truth was out. There was no more denying it. The Chief Justice, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, finally rose from his seat. His voice carried the weight of authority. "Effective immediately. Judge Evelyn Whittaker is removed from this case pending investigation." A hush fell over the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs and gasps. The reporters rushed to the exits, already dialing their newsrooms. Judge Whittaker remained frozen, her once impenetrable power slipping away with each passing second. Marcus inhaled deeply, his heartbeat steadying. He had done it. He had taken down the woman who destroyed his life. The system had tried to silence him, but now it was the system that was breaking apart. And it all started with one voice that refused to back down. The courtroom was filled with anticipation. The air buzzed with nervous energy as Marcus Holloway sat beside his mother, his fingers intertwined with hers. The battle had been long, exhausting, but now, finally, justice was within reach. A new judge had been assigned to their case, a judge with no ties to Evelyn Whittaker, no loyalty to corruption. He sat with a measured expression, his gavel resting lightly in his grip. "Has the jury reached a decision?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The head juror, a woman with short silver hair and sharp eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the room. The tension was unbearable. Marcus gripped his mother's hand tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. "On the charge of unlawful eviction," the juror continued, "we rule in favor of the Holloway family." For a moment, there was silence. Then, cheers erupted. The courtroom exploded with emotion. Spectators clapped, reporters rushed to capture the reaction, and activists who had fought alongside them embraced one another. Marcus felt his breath hitch as his mother turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. She pulled him close, her voice breaking. "We did it, baby." Marcus buried his face in her shoulder, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a victory for them. This was proof that the truth had finally won. Judge Whittaker was gone, her corruption exposed. But the best part? The ruling had forced the city to launch an investigation into all of her past cases. She hadn't just taken their home, she had destroyed countless lives. Now, every single one of those rulings would be reviewed. Marcus looked around the room, seeing the change he had fought for taking shape before his eyes. People weren't just celebrating. They were realizing that justice wasn't just an idea. It was something that could be fought for, something that could be won. And then, just as the noise began to die down, something happened that no one expected. A court official rushed into the room, a stack of documents in his hands, whispering urgently to the prosecutor. The man's face paled as he read the top page, then slowly turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "new evidence has come to light. Evidence that changes everything." The courtroom fell silent once again. Eyes darted between the judge, the prosecutor, and the stack of documents. Marcus sat up straighter, because this fight, it wasn't over yet. Days later, Marcus and his family stepped through the front door of their apartment. The walls, the floors, the scent of home, it all felt different now. This was more than just a return. It was a reclaiming of everything they had lost. His mother, Tasha, walked through the small living room, running her fingers over the furniture that had been untouched since the day they were forced out. Layla, his little sister, spun in a circle, laughing as if she couldn't believe they were truly back. The judge who had once held power over their fate. She was facing trial for corruption. The system that had tried to break them had been forced to acknowledge its failure. And Marcus? His name had become something more than just a boy who lost his home. He had become a symbol of change. The story spread far beyond their neighborhood. News outlets covered it relentlessly. Activists called for deeper investigations, and people Marcus had never met stopped him on the street just to thank him. Families who had suffered similar fates found hope in his story. His name was spoken in city halls, on television panels, and in classrooms where teachers taught about courage and perseverance. At a press conference, reporters gathered, eager to speak to the boy who had taken down a corrupt judge. The room was packed, the buzz of voices filling the air with anticipation. One journalist leaned forward, her microphone extended. "Marcus, how did you find the proof?" she asked. Marcus thought about it for a moment, about the nights spent searching, the determination that never let him stop, and the belief that the truth was always worth fighting for. "I just wanted the truth," he said simply. The crowd murmured in admiration, cameras flashing as the world took in his words. A reporter scribbled the quote in her notepad, while another typed furiously on his laptop. Marcus wasn't just a story anymore. He was an example of what one voice could accomplish. Later that evening, as the excitement died down, Marcus and his family sat together in their apartment, sharing a meal for the first time in what felt like forever. The food wasn't fancy, but it tasted like home. Laughter filled the air, and for once there was no uncertainty hanging over them. No fear of where they would sleep, no worry of what tomorrow would bring. That night, back in their apartment, his mother pulled him into her arms, holding him close. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus rested his head against her shoulder. "I want to help other families too," he said softly. Tasha pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "And you will." Marcus knew she was right. The battle for his home had been won, but his fight for justice had only just begun. He had seen too many families suffer, too many children forced to grow up too soon. He had been one of them, and he wasn't going to stand by while others faced the same fate. In the days that followed, Marcus was invited to speak at community events, sharing his story with those who needed hope. He didn't have all the answers, but he had his voice, and he would use it, because Marcus had won his fight that day, but in the end, he had started a movement.